Uh, okay, thank you for the very warm introductions by Professor Xinjiang. And I'm very happy here today to introduce our recent work to assess the net climate effect of anthropogenic reactive nitrogen. Uh, so I think the general background is very clear for the people in this room that since the pre-industrial, the anthropogenic reactive nitrogen have strongly increased. But this is mainly contributed by the anthropogenic fossil fuel combustions, but more importantly, is by the very famous Haber-Bosch process that fixed the nitrogen from N2 to ammonia. And this anthropogenic reactive nitrogen actually contribute equivalent reactive nitrogens to the whole Earth system as the natural processes, which mainly contributed by the lightning, but more importantly by the biological nitrogen fixation. So the more and more reactive nitrogen actually, on the one hand, is a good thing because this provide more fertilizer to agriculture activities meet the food demand for the increasing population. But at the same time, the excessive reactive nitrogen also lead to many environmental problems, and I think this is why we take care about the reactive nitrogens. And I know that many people in this room have also do many great work to try to understand and solve all of the environmental challenges. But here today, our question is that we want to better understand how the climate responds to this enhanced reactive nitrogen. But however, here our question is that we want to understand another side that regarding the climate effect of anthropogenic reactive nitrogen to understand how the climate responses to this dramatically increased nitrogen loadings. So to understand the climate effect, I think the first thing is that we need to know how nitrogen cycling in the atmosphere, because the atmosphere composition changes will directly translated into the climate effect. So basically, in the atmosphere, there's the nitrogen could be emitted from whatever sources, from the fossil fuel, from the soil, as a forms of the N2O, ammonia, and the nitrogen oxide, normally called NOx. And N2O is actually a very stable gas. It can stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. But for NOx and ammonia, they are very chemical active, so they can have the chemical reactions in the atmosphere with many other components. And in the end, they will be oxidized into the aerosols, and then all the gases and aerosols will be deposited to land or ocean. But it's not sufficient for us to only understand the nitrogen process in the atmosphere, because nitrogen is actually also cycling in the terrestrial ecosystem. That basically nitrogen comes through a decomposition process that decomposes it from the organic part as a inorganic part, and then through the nitrification, the nitrification process, the inorganic nitrogen will be emitted, go back to the atmosphere as a forms, the different kind of nitrogen forms. So, and more importantly, is nitrogen is also a very important nutrient that can be uptaken by the plant and the soil microbes. So, and the nitrogen processes in the land is also very important for us to better understand the whole nitrogen cycle and as well as the anthropogenic perturbation. So here in this talk, I will want to combining my background in the training during my PhD, I trained as a atmospherical chemist to understand the processes in the atmosphere, and during my postdocs, I was trained to use the terrestrial biosphere model to understand how the nitrogen that is cycling in the terrestrial ecosystem. So by combining these two, we hope that through this talk, through this study, we could better understand how the anthropogenic reactive nitrogen that influence the climate. So there is actually different pathways that nitrogen could influence the climate. The first is N2O that we all know. N2O is a greenhouse gas. It can strongly warm the climate. But at the same time, the nitrogen addition to the terrestrial ecosystem provide more nutrient, so it could enhance the nutrient supplies to the plants and further enhance the photosynthesis rate. And that means there could be a higher carbon storage in the terrestrial ecosystem. So more carbon in the land means less CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So it could potentially lead to a cooling effect. And more importantly is that the short-lived nitrogen gas like NOx and ammonia, they can generate aerosols, and aerosols can diffuse solar radiation, further lead to a cooling effect to the climate. And last but not least, the NOx is also strongly participating in the atmospheric chemistry process, so it can influence the lifetime of methane by influence the OH concentration in the atmosphere. But at the same time, NOx also generates ozone, and both methane and ozone are greenhouse gas, and it also have the climate effect to have some climate effect. So with this very comprehensive framework that is including the processes in the atmosphere, but also processes in the land, we want to better understand that by combining the knowledge with the terrestrial biosphere model and atmospheric chemistry model. But before I go to the method, I think it's very necessary to give a little bit introductions about what is the radiative forcing, because we want to use radiative forcing here to define this climate effect. So this is, I think this is from the climate science, that if we look, say the whole Earth system, the whole Earth as a point, then basically at the top of the atmosphere, there is a radiative balance, that we have the incoming radiation that basically from the solar radiation, but we also have the long wave radiation because our Earth have some temperature. And before the pre-industrial, that this balance should be generally is an equilibrium state, that there is the incoming fluxes and the outgoing fluxes is basically the same. But we all know that the anthropogenic activities strongly perturbate this balance, and this lead to some differences. So in climate science, we normally to use this this differences in the radiative balance as a radiative forcing to describe how the anthropogenic activities that influence climate. So with that, here is the method that we used. We first involved in the MIP2 project, which is organized by the Professor Han Qingtian in Boston College. And so there is actually 8 different terrestrial biosphere models with fully coupled carbon-nitrogen cycles, so that for each model, we can simulate the soil N2O, NOx, and ammonia emissions, as well as the nitrogen influences on the terrestrial carbon storage. And more importantly, for each model, that we isolate the different anthropogenic sectors, for example, from the fertilizer and manure application, from the nitrogen deposition, and so on, that to understand how the anthropogenic activities that influence the different soil nitrogen emissions and the terrestrial carbon fluxes. And but this is all about the soil fluxes. And we all know that there is a large part of the nitrogen is actually directly emitted to the atmosphere through the fossil fuel combustion. And for this part, we use the CDS inventories. And by combining the soil emissions and the fossil fuel combustion emission, that we can further put all the emissions into the GeoChem model, which is a 3D chemical transport model, try to calculate the chemical transport and chemical reactions in the atmosphere. So we can get from the emissions of the ammonia and NOx, we can get the concentrations of aerosols and ozone. And we also use 3 different box models to diagnose how the nitrogen emission changes that influence the atmospheric CO2, N2O, and methane concentrations. And in the end, that we can put all the aerosols, ozone concentration, and also the long-lived greenhouse gas, CO2, N2O, and methane into the radiative transfer model to diagnose the radiative transfer processes in the atmosphere, and to get this radiative forcings of the anthropogenic reactive nitrogen. And here is basically the main results, that we first found that because of nitrogen addition that provide more nutrient to the terrestrial ecosystem, it's increased the terrestrial carbon storage and further reduce the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. But this cooling effect is strongly offset by the warming effect, because nitrogen addition also stimulate more N2O emissions and higher N2O concentrations in the atmosphere. But however, more importantly, here through the NOx effect on the methane lifetime and also the enhanced aerosol concentrations in the atmosphere, these two together contribute a very strong cooling effect. And although the NOx-induced ozone concentration increase somehow offset this cooling effect, but here we still conclude that there is a net cooling effect of anthropogenic reactive nitrogen since pre-industrial to present day, which this number is basically offset around 1/6 warming led by the CO2 increases if we compared with the CO2-related forcings numbers that was reported by the IPCC. So I think this is a very important conclusion that we really understand that how the anthropogenic reactive nitrogen that influence the climate. But more importantly is that we want to better understand what will happen in the future with this climate, how this kind of climate effect changed in responses to different nitrogen scenarios. So here we try to apply 3 different nitrogen scenarios that follow the SSP1, SSP3, and SSP5. And SSP1 is basically a nitrogen clean scenario that the fossil fuel emissions of the NOx and also the nitrogen deposition has strongly decreased. But however, we also found that for the manure and the fertilizer application in these scenarios, it don't change that much globally because in this scenario, we still assume that we still need to put a lot of fertilizer and manure into the agriculture activities to meet the food demands for the population. But anyway, follow this scenario that we found in the future, this net cooling effect is somehow is become weakened under the SSP1 scenario. So that means that under if we reduce nitrogen, reactive nitrogen, especially if we reduce the nitrogen from the fossil fuel sources, then on the one hand, we get the benefit from the environmental side. We have clean air, we have better water quality, but at the same time, the climate maybe get warm more fast. So this gives us an implication that on the one hand, we need to really care about this nitrogen reduction because this also benefit for the environment. But at the same time, consider about this climate change mitigation, we actually need more stronger reductions in other greenhouse gases to together with the nitrogen reduction to achieve this kind of win-win scenarios. So this is basically the general results of this study. And so here I will take a little bit more time to talk about the knowledge gaps or some challenges that we are facing to better understand the climate effect of anthropogenic reactive nitrogen. So this is basically the framework that how we understand this climate effect, that we need to understand the nitrogen emissions, and then we should better understand what does this emission means to the concentration changes in the atmospheric components. And then with the changes in the atmosphere components, then we need to know how this influences the radiative transfer process and as well as climate. So I would say that in each part that we all have some difficulties or have some knowledge gaps to better quantify or understand that. So first, I want to also show that our recent study is not published, it's under review, but I think that we look at we want to better understand how the agricultural fertilizer induced soil NOx changed from 1950 to present day. And in this study, we try to integrating different methods that from the atmospheric chemistry modeling, from the terrestrial biosphere modeling, and from the emission inventories or from the emission factors, which is widely used, but we also try to use the fixed emission factors or nonlinear emission factors from the meta-analysis. Anyway, we tried to basically tried every method that now exists, and then we found that fertilizer-induced soil NOx emissions really varies a lot in the end. So it gave us an implication that because in the past that we put many efforts try to quantify the emission factors, so the N2O emissions, because N2O is a greenhouse gas, is strongly related with the climate. But for the short-lived nitrogen gases that emitted from the soil, like the NOx and ammonia, that we still have limited data and also have very poor constraints about that. So it's bringing large uncertainties for us to better understand the overall nitrogen budget and the climate effect. And by the way, I also want to mention that there is also another nitrogen gas, nitrous acid, sometimes people also say it's HONO, which could be also very important for the atmospheric oxidation capacity and associated nitrate aerosols and ozone concentrations. And for that, we know much less than the ammonia and NOx. But this is just from the emission side. And even though we can get the emission very precisely, but it doesn't mean that we can precisely predict the changes in the atmosphere. It is mainly because that for the aerosol chemistry and also the atmospheric OH chemistry, there is still a large uncertainties. So here I show two cases that basically from the multiple model comparison that for each model, here the different different names is from different atmospheric chemistry model, and they all use the same emission inventories. But still, with the same emissions, they can get totally different nitrate aerosol burdens in the atmosphere and also large varied changes in the methane lifetime. So this is, I think, is still a large difficulties in the atmospheric chemistry that people is still, even now today, that we still not cannot really easy to constrain the nitrate aerosol simulations and also the OH dynamics in the atmosphere. And in the end, for the radiative forcing diagnose that for the, I think, general for the greenhouse gas, for the like CO2, N2O, methane, ozone, the radiative forcing estimates are relatively robust. I don't say there is no uncertainties because if you see from this figure from the IPCC report that the CO2 and also ozone, they all have some uncertainties there. But if we compare with the aerosol radiative forcings, here, as this bar shows, you can see that aerosols almost contribute the largest uncertainties for us to better understand the radiative forcing. It is mainly because we have many assumptions on the aerosol size, aerosol distributions in the atmosphere, but more importantly, the aerosol interactions with the cloud. This is still some challenging things for us to better understand the total climate effect. And beyond all of that, that actually we are facing a very complex Earth system, that there is many feedbacks in the Earth system. For example, here in our study, there is some processes that are not fully considered, although we know that processes should be not be the dominant things that to influence the climate, but they still contribute something there. So the first maybe is because the nitrogen could change the aerosols and ozones in the atmosphere, but the aerosol and ozone can give a feedback to the terrestrial carbon fluxes, so it will have a further influence on the carbon cycle. And the second is when the methane concentration changes, then it will at the same time change the tropospheric ozone and the tropospheric water. Is all related to the chemistry processes in the atmosphere, and also the nitrogen fertilization effect on the Arctic and marine biogeochemistry is not considered here. But we know that this kind of effect will not change the overall results, that's the cooling effect, but the numbers or the total or the magnitude could be somehow changed. And so this is basically the end of my talk, that we try our best to quantify all the processes that we know, and we get a conclusion that the net climate effect on this anthropogenic reactive nitrogen is a cooling effect. But we're still facing many challenges to quantify the short-lived soil nitrogen emissions, to better understand the atmospheric aerosol chemistry, and also we are facing higher degrees of the Earth system feedbacks, which definitely need more work in the future to better understand this the net climate effect on anthropogenic reactive nitrogen. So this is the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards.
Great. Thank you, Cheng. I really like your framework for showing all those knowledge gaps at the end. And I believe that gonna generate a lot of interesting discussions. Any quick clarification question before we move on to Wim? And also feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And I hope that we will have a very productive discussions after Wim's presentation.
Oh,
okay.
Yes.
Well, yeah. I guess Wim, I don't think you need much introduction in this crowd, but yeah, but it's great to really have you here to share your work. And Wim is a professor of environmental system analysis at the Wageningen University, and I mean, yeah, your work on the integrated nitrogen impact analysis probably has touched upon many of our ongoing work in the nitrogen cycles. Yeah, what about you? Just take it away from here. I'm also looking forward to hear your talk on this topic.
Thank you, Xin. Thank you. Then I'll try to share my screen on this. Yes, there it is. I hope you see it now. Is that correct? Well, my presentation is about, again, the same topic as one from Cheng. It's about the net climate effects of anthropogenic nitrogen, but we did a comparable study as he did, by we combined empirical and process-based model approaches. And I added some names of people who also were involved, like Lena Schulte-Übing, and you can read this here. And I like to start, but that was already presented in principle by Cheng, so I will be short, about what is the linkage between fixation and, let's say, warming and cooling. It's highly complex, to be honest. But what you see roughly is, you think about end fixation. It's on one hand, let's say, the Haber-Bosch process, end fixation in agriculture, and biological fixation, leading to direct N2O emissions and partly indirect, like ammonia being emitted, leading to N deposition, leading to indirect emissions, easy from forests. But it can also be nitrate leaching going to surface waters and there leading to indirect emissions. The N deposition also affects methane emissions, although that's not so big. But for example, NOx can affect the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere. But a very important cooling effect is that nitrogen, when it comes onto, let's say, forests, it in principle enhances forest growth. Up to a certain level, of course. I mean, if it's too high, like in our country, above 25, 30 kilograms, you can get too much acidification, and it's not unlimited anymore. But over the globe, it generally enhances forest growth and soil carbon sequestration. So that's then a cooling effect, because it's more CO2 sequestered. That again bring it to here, the CO2 goes down. So the blue one are the cooling. An example is, of course, aerosol. Jen told a lot about it. But NOx, you can also think of ozone formation, which is a greenhouse gas by itself, but also reduces, for example, forest growth, and thereby leads to cooling of warming by enhanced CO2 emissions. Now, all these effects are there. And now, I'm not sure, I'm sorry, but somehow the system didn't. Yeah. So a little bit about the difference between long-lived climate forces and short-lived. Long-lived, we use it as N2O, methane, and CO2, although I agree. Do you hear me? Okay. That methane is a somewhere intermediate with a time of about 12 years only, but the short-lived are really in the atmosphere for hours or days or some weeks, like NOx, ammonia, aerosols, and ozone. And you have to use them, of course, differently if you think over a 20 or 100-year time period. Now, what I like to tell you is, first, what are the impacts on nitrogen on the long-lived climate forces? So what do process-based and empirical model approaches show to the responses of methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2 to inputs? And what's the spatial variation? And then the short-lived and the overall impact. And my overall conclusion is very comparable to what you heard before, but I like to say a bit more about this empirical. So we did in this study a comparison between, on one hand, an empirical model where we simply multiplied over the globe the spatial variation in N inputs with the response of these three greenhouse gases to the N inputs. And we used for that If you look to terrestrial ecosystem, fertilization experiments, you fertilize or do not fertilize, so-called gradient studies, that you look over the globe at high deposition and low deposition, and what do you see as differently, and a method called stoichiometric scaling. These one, the latter two, were only done for CO2. And in this presentation, I limit myself to fertilization experiments because I do not have time to tell all the other things. And as a dynamic process-based model, we use the model DLEM. One of the models involved in the study by Cheng. But I focus a lot on this empirical approach. So the principal idea was simply look what the N inputs are to an ecosystem and what is the response of N2O to it, CO2 to it, and methane to it. This is very linear, as you can see here. We estimated the N inputs to croplands and pasture, which is then fertilizer, manure, biological N fixation, and of course also deposition with the image model. On forests and other natural land, on oceans, it was the deposition included. We used the model TM5 FAST. And for inlet and coastal waters, we used river N loads coming from image GNM. So that is, let's say, this part, the N input to the ecosystem. And it was all about getting the responses for all the ecosystems. And we used that, we brought it all to the global warming potential by these radiative forcings over 100 years. Now, this was we used for N2O and methane, for example. This is an example. Huh? How does it react to N addition in a forest ecosystem? We used publications from so-called meta-analysis where all kinds of experiments were included, and then looked to what were the responses. And here you see an example, a forest biome. You have a temperate forest, a subtropical forest, tropical forest, and a boreal forest, and the response of N2O to an N input. And as you see, there is a big difference between boreal forest with hardly any response and subtropical, where it is quite significant. And here you see also the relative impacts of various factors, which we also included in our estimates. Now, this type of experiments was used in making the estimates in the empirical model. And the same was the case with methane, where you also see big differences with boreal forest, where even methane was depressed. So, I mean, there was less methane emission from the forest if N was added as compared to other forests. And in the paper, we give all the reasons for this. Why is this so? And also made even difference between high and low N additions, because generally you see that these N inputs in experiments are far higher than N deposition ever over the globe. I mean, 60 kilograms of N deposition you only find in parts of China and India now, but 99% is lower. So we made this differentiation because you see if it's below 60, it's completely different from high inputs. Now, this is just an example of what did we use in, let's say, and here I do, in these experiments. And this is another one, a publication I did with my colleague Lena Schulte. We went through all the literature to see experiments where they added nitrogen and then looked into gross increases and added and estimated nitrogen content in the stem wood. And then just see what's the woody biomass increment after N addition and no N addition, and then calculate the C to N ratio. We did it for many experiments and then looked, does the response vary between forest biomes? And of course, again, it does. That's a publication we had in 2018. And this is simply saying, if you add 1 kilogram of nitrogen on a forest, on average, 11 kilogram of carbon is sequestered by enhanced growth. That's what it is, an enhanced growth. And what you clearly see, there is a huge difference between tropical with hardly an effect and much higher in boreal, because tropical forests are mostly phosphorus limited and not nitrogen limited. And also a very important one, the N deposition rate or the N addition rate. And 30 kilogram is typical N deposition, which is, that's generally not more than 30. And then you're much higher than when you have very high inputs, which is logic, because then, of course, with high inputs, you get negative impacts of forest soil acidification and so on. Now, all this information was added in a table because this is I just showed you some examples of experiments where we looked to 3 types of forest: N2O, CO2, and methane. You see here the ranges, but we did it in cropland, in pasture, in shrublands, in inland and coastal waters, in marine systems. What Cheng was telling, that's very uncertain. What happens if nitrogen comes into a marine system with the N2O? How does the carbon respond? Huge uncertainties. But at least we looked upon all the literature to do those estimates. And the last one was, for example, what happens if you add ozone? Because NOx will induce ozone formation, and ozone generally reduces growth. What you see here on the x-axis is the so-called phytotoxic ozone dose, and on the y-axis you see the relative net annual increment. So roughly you see that forest growth is decreasing strongly with an increased ozone exposure. That's typically for beech or birch. It's much less, for example, for other tree species. So to apply such information, you do need the tree species map over the globe. Huh? And of course, you have to say, what is the contribution of NOx to that ozone exposure? Now, again, all taken from the literature, empirical data, and used in the modeling approach. So what comes out of this? Because I will not go into the process-based model DLM. It's one of the process-based models. The interesting point is more, this was the spatial variation that we found in warming by N2O emissions, cooling by enhanced carbon sequestration. Methane was not having a big effect because have a look at the legend. This legend goes to 0.25 for N2O, and the same is true for reduced carbon sequestration, reduced emissions, enhanced. But this one is going 10 times lower, 0.025. So you can say the net effect is mainly enhanced N2O compensated by enhanced carbon sequestration. And then you see parts is cooling, but like China and India and Western Europe, etc., is mainly warming. And if you then look to the DLEM model, you see, of course, the similar fact: warming, cooling, overall roughly the same regions. And if you now go to a table, and maybe I like to put and you look, how does the empirical model compare to DLEM? And you ultimately go to, let's say, all the land, and this is in teragram. It's really quite comparable. 1800, 1500, 2000, 2000. This is warming, this is cooling, this is warming. But the net effect is really quite different. And of course, it's also, although the total can be the same, it can be quite different between different ecosystems. But if you consider the uncertainty, which I haven't given here, it's quite overlapping. And it was quite nice to see that these completely different approaches lead to comparable results. Now, a similar point you find here on the top, the empirical approach. What does NOx, ozone, induced reduction in CO2 sequestration? So NOx leads to ozone formation. Ozone formation reduces forest growth. That reduces then CO2 sequestration in the trees and thus also in the soils. And you see here above the empirical approach, below DLEM. And again, if you look to a table, then you see all kinds of variations in cropland and pasture and range. But if you look to the total number, biomass on soils, 612 teragram, and it's 702. Sorry, I didn't show the unit here for the LEM. So that's quite fascinating that such different approaches lead to overall quite comparable results, although it differs spatially. Okay, then shortly something on the climate forces. That's not really my field of expertise. That was mainly Rita van Dingen who did that kind of work. And what now, Cheng already told you a lot about what does N do to short-lived climate forces. Now, it induces ozone formation that leads to warming, because ozone is a greenhouse gas. And as we told before, ozone reduces carbon sequestration. NOx reduces the lifetime of methane. So that's cooling. And indirectly also of ozone. And ammonia and NOx induce the formation of aerosols. And that's again cooling. And if you look here, estimates, you see here estimates that say, okay, on one hand, you see a warming effect, NOx to ozone, but on the other hand, you see all kinds of cooling effects. And the sum, that's something we did, is really overall cooling, as already told by John. So what we did is that, okay, the global warming potential for a 100-year period to get to CO2 equivalent values is not applicable, because, I mean, short-lived climate forces like aerosols and ozone, they stay in the atmosphere for days or weeks. So over 100 years, an emission pulse has a negligible impact. And we used the so-called rate of emission change to assess a CO2 star equivalent value. Now, that's quite complicated, but that's what we did. And the way we worked is that we multiplied NOx and ammonia emission changes in a 20-year period with the TM5 FAST model with region-specific of those CO2 equivalent values. So it's a bit a different approach for the SCLFs. And the main thing is this. If you now look to the overall impact of nitrogen and we look to the long-lived, then you see that the warming and the cooling is quite comparable. Warming by N2O, warming by enhanced CO2 because, enhanced N2O, warming because of reduced CO2, that's the ozone effect. There's also enhanced methane, that's mainly coming from rivers. But on the other hand, there is the cooling, specifically of CO2 in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And that's mainly nitrogen enhancing growth. But if you look to the short-lived, look at the zero number. You see here 0. It's only NOx enhancing ozone that is really leading to warming. But all the other impacts, like aerosols, reducing the lifetime of methane, reducing the lifetime of ozone, leads to cooling effects. And that means that overall, if you take them all together, there's cooling. That's exactly the same message as the previous speaker. But yeah, let's say confirmed by different approaches. And I'm coming now to my final slides. What we also did in this study at the end was running a model where a prediction was made for the coming 100 years in a scenario where nitrogen is reduced. And there you find exactly that what Cheng was also saying. If we reduce nitrogen fixation and through that ammonia emissions and NOx emissions, you initially will get a warming effect. A warming effect because on the one hand, the N2O goes down. That's clear. N2O goes down. But since you reduce ammonia and NOx emissions, that's the response, you also reduce aerosols concentrations. And since aerosols are cooling, a reduced cooling is a warming. And since NOx reduces the lifetime of methane and NOx is reduced, methane is longer in the atmosphere. So that's a warming. I must say that in this modeling, I'm a little bit amazed that the CO2 impact is so low. That's to me a big uncertainty to discuss. But I mean, the overall message is, if you look to temperature, yes, N2O will lead to reduced N2O will lead to cooling. The other impacts will lead to warming, and we expect that initially 20, 30 years it's warming, and only after about 100 years you come to a net cooling effect, because then N2O is overwhelming the others. Now, that's more or less the end. Roughly, so what this study concludes is that N2O emissions are about for 70 to 100% compensated by CO2 uptake. It's even about 100 if you think about the N-induced CO2 uptake, but NOx reduces that again. But the cooling of short-lived climate forces is about 3 times as high as the warming. And that means that overall, you will have a cooling, and that reductions in NUs will first cause warming, mainly by reduced aerosol concentrations, followed by cooling. And that's mainly by reduced N2O. I have decided not, and because of time, to say anything else about, let's say, I stop it, anything else about uncertainties. Wait a second. But maybe to say one word on it. Already Cheng said about the big uncertainty about nitrogen linked to aerosols. That's a huge uncertainty. There's, of course, lots, also a serious point, I think, about the CO2 sequestration. It could be too positive if you look over the longer term. What will be the impact possibly of long-term N deposition on pests and diseases and soil acidification, etc.? Will there be nonlinear responses? Many of the responses here were taken as empirically constant. Of course, in models, they are not nonlinear, but they're all spatially variable. So there are still many aspects to be discussed if we think about the 10 big research gaps to be explored. Thank you.
Thank you, Wim. So now you hear 2 relevant but also independent studies on this topic, and it's really a very interesting and somehow controversial topic as we're pursuing the goal of having the nitrogen waste. There's also this critical question regarding its interplays with climate mitigation efforts. So I'm just kind of take advantage of my role as a moderator to ask 2 initial questions, and then we can move on to the great questions that in the chat. I guess my question to you both will be, on one hand, so it seems the 2 studies that arrive at the similar conclusions that will end up, the net effect of reactive nitrogen, anthropogenic reactive mitigation may lead to a potential cooling effect on the climate. So I wonder, based on your experience or understanding of your model and experiments, which part of the analysis that carries the highest uncertainties, and whether the uncertainties may lead to the change of whether the level of uncertainty may lead to the change of the direction of the net effect. And then the second question will be, yeah, from your point of view, based on what you have learned so far, what would be the implications for the nitrogen mitigation community and the actions for the climate change? What do you think the message should be or could be for kind of engaging the policy and policy community or other main actors in this climate and nitrogen mitigation space?
You first, Jen, or yeah?
Okay, maybe I can start because then we must have more insights than me. So, but maybe I'll just start. So I think for the first question regarding about the uncertainties, so I somehow because I have a background in the ethnochemistry, so I'm facing that there is quite large uncertainties in the aerosols, as I already said in my talk, and for the nitrates, if you see these numbers from the many Earth system modeling, you can see that the nitrate cooling effect goes from 0 to many large numbers. But we still not really quite know, and so the thing is that we don't really have many observations to really constrain this climate effect. We can constrain the aerosol concentrations in the atmosphere, but for the effect on the radiative forcing, it's still not very easy, especially from the global perspective. And I also agree with Wim that the nitrogen deposition effect on the terrestrial carbon storage, this part is somehow maybe overestimated, or at least there is some large uncertainties because basically currently in the land surface model, we only consider about the nutrient perspective, but there is also many other perspectives that damage the biodiversity, lead to soil acidification. It's all negative effects is not really considered in the land surface model. So I would say that these two parts maybe have the largest uncertainties from my perspective, from my understanding, that could somehow lead to the results. I would say influence the magnitude, but maybe not the overall directions. And for the implication, I would say, yeah, in our paper, we just say that it's in the future, we need reduce nitrogen, but at the same time, we need to accompany with more other greenhouse gases to be the stronger other GHG reductions that to offset this kind of cooling effect. But I think another important issue is about the scenario, because in my scenario, or yeah, in some scenarios, because the fossil fuel sources reduced really significantly. But for the agricultural sources, it is, at least in my studies, not really reduced a lot. And we could somehow improve the agricultural management to especially reduce the N2O emissions. As also Wim talk shows that N2O has a much longer much longer effect on the climate. So I think we still have many work to do in the agricultural management to try to balance this climate effect. Yeah.
Maybe to add, I would like, I think similar things. First like to say that if you think about the response of N2O to nitrogen inputs, you can say that is in principle measurable. I mean, that's what Eric Davidson also did. You can see how the N2O is increasing in the atmosphere, and that's a simple N response. So that if you then think about the CO2 response to N, that's not that.
Wim,
I mean, that's a contribution. And as said, do you hear me or not? Yeah. So what I'm saying, N2O responses, although uncertain locally, it's quite robust at the global scale. But the carbon response, specifically for the long term, is really more uncertain because of what happens indeed on the longer term when you think about other aspects. Another thing I like to mention is, of course, if you think about politically, there is simply a strong wish to reduce particulate matter and aerosol pollution because of human health impacts. I mean, PM 2.5 is the biggest human health impact almost on the globe, right? So there's reason to do that. That means that we have to be aware that if we do this, we should also strongly work on methane reductions, because that is at least a strong direct effect, only 12 years a lifetime, to avoid this trade-off of increased health, but also increased temperature. And yeah, that's not so uncertain. That's something you directly have to be aware of. Yeah. Of course, the order of magnitude is uncertain, but the direction is clear. Yeah.
Great. We have some great questions in the chat. I can, for the short one I can read, but for the longer one maybe I can ask or invite the colleague who put in the question to ask directly. So Claire has a question on, are the results different if you go to a regional scale, such as continental?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, strongly. Yeah, I mean that's what we presented. I think also Chen presented, but regionally it can be so that you even have a cooling effect in a region where the carbon sequestration is, for example, bigger than the N2O emissions, and the other way around. But on the other hand, of course, it's the overall. I mean, since, let's put it this way, for ammonia and impacts of ammonia on biodiversity, that's extremely important, because that's a local, regional scale issue. For N2O and methane, it's interesting to show, but ultimately it's a uniform concentration all over the globe that affects the climate. Yeah.
Maybe I add one thing that I generally agree that I think for the long-lived greenhouse gas, like the CO2, N2O, and methane, that basically they distributed evenly in the globe, and so in my studies, just applying the same concentrations, but it's basically because I consider about the radiative forcing that is regarding the global things, but for the short-lived pollutants like the NOx, ozone, and ammonia and aerosols, all of this, they have a very strong regional distribution because they can only stay in the atmosphere from days to weeks.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. So I would like to invite Sumaya to unmute and ask your question. Or is that Ida?
Hi. Thank you. It was excellent talk. I'm both the speakers. I really learned a lot. I come from a measurement background, and I have done flux measurement in agriculture area. So when I see these kind of like a global model output, my question is automatically, I mean, we all here understand that how challenging are the ammonia measurement, or for that matter, any soil flux measurement. So what was the input data? Sorry if I missed that. What kind of measurement input data was considered for Wim? You can answer, or Chen. I mean, yeah.
Maybe I can start with measurement. I mean, the whole idea of this approach is a bit like what you do with emission inventories, if you take the empirical one. So on one hand, you have activity data, and on the other hand, if you take emissions, you have CO2 emissions per activity, etc. And here the same thing is, on one hand, we had models that estimated inputs by deposition, etc. And these models has, as far as possible, been validated on measurements. Yeah, that's what I tried. And all the responses, at least in the empirical approach, was based on measurements, right? So the whole idea of such a global thing is a modeling exercise where process-based models do completely in modeling, and empirical models, they combine, let's say, model-based inputs by measurement-based responses. Of course, and these measurements have been based on experiments all over the globe and then are extrapolated. And that's, of course, making the uncertainty. Yeah, that's making the uncertainty. Yeah, to To give you one example, if you take the response of NOx and ammonia and N2O to an N input, it depends on crop type, on land use, or let's say on land use, on site conditions, climate, soil type, groundwater level, etc. So what we did is rather global averaged kind of response factors, or average for all the temperate forest or boreal forest. But of course, there is much more detailed variation in between, as measurements show.
Yeah, and for the modeling, I think it's relatively straightforward that we have the activity data, we have the input for the fertilizer and the manure, and then just the model do their work. So, but the thing is that model maybe consider more processes. They I think all the crop types, also the different nitrogen processes in the soil, everything is considered, but we still not say that more complicated processes means more precise results is not always not the truth. But we really do compare the model generated soil different nitrogen gas emissions. That means from the global budget perspective, it's roughly aligned with what we measured or what we learned from the measurement, and also the special distributions. But if you exactly on some one site or exactly on some locations, then it's definitely there is large uncertainties there.
Thank you. Ida, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Yeah, would you mind to introduce yourself and then talk about your questions?
Yeah, sure. I'm Ida, and I'm from the University of Aarhus doing a PhD there, and now I have this policy fellowship in INET. And I think my question is both to Wim and Cheng, and I just want to understand a bit better how land use change is taken into account in the models, also in the future scenarios, because in my mind, the increased N input, which in your model shows a cooling effect because of an increased biomass, is also a consequence of converting forest into farmland. And in my head, that would have the opposite effect. So can you talk a bit about that dynamic?
I have to think, because maybe about the future, that's only in our study about this future prediction in the next 100 years. That was done by one of our colleagues at the end, to be honest. That is Drew Schindel. I should have mentioned his name, honestly, on the list, I realize, at the moment, because he did it at the end. And as far as I know, land use change was somehow included in this, because this was a so-called SSP RCP scenario. And as you know, these SSPs lead to some land use change impacts. But I'm not fully sure how this is included. And of course, this is a huge uncertainty about do you assume the same land use, or do you include land use changes? And if included for the next 100 years, that's nothing more than a scenario assessment with all its uncertainties involved. But I agree that's a big one. Yeah.
From the model side, that the NMAP, that what the land surface model examples that I used, they basically now only do the historical simulations that including the land use change effect. And there is also sensitivity experiments try to isolate that, basically fix the land use as in pre-industrial, and to see how this effect changed the N2O emissions and other gas emissions. But in this study, we do not include that, because we just want to say how was the most direct nitrogen input the effect on the climate. So there could be land use change, but there also could be climate change, could be the CO2 concentration change in the atmosphere. All of that will have this kind of indirect effect. And for the future, so I think I basically, at least in my study, would not really consider about that, and maybe it's definitely need more work to do to try to isolate that.
Yeah. Maybe to add, I think it's the same in this study, that all these issues, what will do climate change in itself, and land use change, and changes, how will that affect? I think it was indeed showing what will be the effect of a scenario if we take the current situation. And then you can always include all these other aspects and see how does it affect. Because climate change, for example, will also affect N2O response factors. I mean, the response of, let's say, the response of ammonia emissions towards manure application or nitrogen fertilizer application is affected by temperature and by climate change. I saw here Mark Sutton in the group, but he has worked on that quite a lot. These aspects have not been included in the future calculations at the moment. So that's another real important thing, at least not in the empirical assessment that we did. And I'm not sure in the others. No.
Great. Yeah, I'm aware that we are almost running out of time and still want to leave some time for the task force updates. But we do have 2 more questions about wetlands. So I would like to invite our colleague to ask the question. Yeah, please introduce yourself, because I know that we're getting started with the working groups and we're still getting to know each other. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Dominique from Toulouse in France and working on nitrogen emission and deposition in Africa. So my question was for Wim about wetlands. So in the first table, you have shown that the effect of nitrogen on greenhouse gas emission was quite strong. I think it was through methane, if I'm not wrong. But I was wondering, in your last table at the global scale, are you including the effect on wetlands? I'm not sure about that.
No, that's a very good question. And it is, of course, I know, of course, that wetlands can, first of all, can have a big methane emissions, of course, at one end. And there is also the issues of drained peatlands in our country with huge CO2 emissions, just as another example. But the question, of course, what you're doing here is how does nitrogen input on a wetland affect the methane emission? And that's the point, of course. So what's the effect of nitrogen input on N2O emissions and methane emissions from a wetland? It's not specifically included. I think that in all the estimates, also wetland has been part of it. But I have to check whether wetlands reacted really differently in terms of response. The methane to N input response, how different was that in a wetland in an experiment which we had compared to the other ecosystems? Okay. And I think that was quite limited. Although, of course, the methane emissions as such are higher, it's more about the response of the methane to an N input. And I will check it for you. But wetlands were not included as a separate land use with areas and a separate response, honestly spoken, no.
Yeah, and what about N2O then? What about the impact of N on N2O?
N2O, there was differences made, for example, in peatland. I know that N2O emissions responses of input to peatlands is bigger than on sandy soils, and that we included. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. I don't know, Jonathan, do you want to ask about the South Sudan?
Sure.
Interesting patterns. Yeah.
I'm Jonathan Hickman. I'm actually in the data working group, but I do work with the NASA climate model and have done NOx and N2O emissions for a long time. So looking at the global maps, it looked like South Sudan in particular was a real hotspot for N-induced N2O emissions. Maybe I misread it, but I was curious what the mechanism was, why they were so high there.
Which region do you now mean?
In South Sudan, so it's
yeah. I had that question. I think Klaus Butterbach. Well, it's a good question because I've had that question once the same. Maybe there are others who can tell this. There is this region in Africa where there is quite a hotspot of N emissions, and whether that has to do with, I cannot give you the precise answer, but I promise you that I will send it to you because I know that Klaus Butterbach-Baal is the person who can answer it. I once asked him the same question.
Yeah, I can ask Klaus as well. But the only thing that I could think of is that, there is a very large wetland there, or livestock. It seems much too large.
No,
but
I don't think it's wetlands. I do not think it has to do with. I remember I asked him, but I forgot, and
Great.
That's what I have to.
Thanks.
I'll ask. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all for the great discussion. I believe that triggers a lot of interesting follow-up conversations. And also, I think some of the key uncertainty areas that highlighted in the discussion can be also fold into the ongoing preparation for this 10 answered questions. So I'm looking forward to engage with Cheng, Wim, and also all the colleagues here to further along this 10 answered question paper. So with that, I hope it's okay. Let's give it a round of applause for Wim and Cheng. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your expertise. Yeah.